She used to love just shaking the Jiffy Pop over the oven, and then we would watch it just grow. And we would love eating that together. We often would eat that and watch Seinfeld. My parents let me watch Seinfeld when I was a young child, and that was just one of my favorite pastimes. So, Jiffy Pop and then mocha almond chip ice cream. That was one of her favorites and also was one of mine.
I'm Dalia Colon, and this is the season 12 premiere of The Zest. Citrus, seafood, Spanish flavor, Southern charm, and this season we're setting the table with an extra helping of joy. Today, a woman learns to rediscover the joy of food. For so many of us, food is one of life's great pleasures. But what happens when that joy gets taken away, and can you get it back? That's what we're talking about today with Mallary Tenore Tarpley. She is the author of a new memoir titled Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. Mallary teaches journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, and before that, she spent a decade living in Florida, including working as a reporter at the Tampa Bay Times, where I was one of her colleagues. Lucky me. Mallary will return to the Sunshine State on her book tour. You can catch her on August 19th at Tombolo Books in St. Petersburg in conversation with the city's poet laureate, Gloria Muñoz. So here now is my conversation with Mallary Tenore Tarpley.
I'm Mallary Tenore Tarpley, and I am a journalism professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And I am the author of the book Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery.
Wow, congratulations on the book. You've got a copy behind you. And I should say we met in our 20s when we were both cub reporters at the Tampa Bay Times. So it's so cool to follow your career, and now you have this book out in the world. Amazing. Okay, I love the title. Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. So talk me through the messy middle, the beginning, middle, and does eating disorder recovery ever have an end?
Yes, it's such a great question. And just by way of very brief background, I struggled with an eating disorder throughout my adolescence. So when I was 12, I developed anorexia nervosa after my mother died of metastatic breast cancer, and was in and out of treatment on several occasions, was hospitalized 5 times and in residential treatment for a year and a half. So really struggled for quite a while. And when I left treatment when I was 15, I really tried to achieve the gold standard of full recovery. And yet I didn't really know exactly what that meant. And so I went back to high school my junior year and tried to get all A's and get involved in every extracurricular possible, and was trying to eat perfectly and exercise just the right amount and love my body. And I thought, well, if this is what full recovery is, then I'm getting an A plus. But it was hard to maintain that. And I was really afraid of making any mistakes or wrong moves because I feared that if I slipped, I would very quickly slide back into dangerous territory. And fast forward to college, I did end up slipping and relapsing because I really didn't verbalize the slips. And I fell into this very vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting, which lasted for well over a decade and really didn't feel like I could tell anyone. And I kept telling people outwardly that I was fully recovered, even though inwardly I was very much struggling. And so eventually I was working with journalists on how to tell restorative narratives, which are essentially these stories that show how people make meaningful progress in the aftermath of illness or trauma. And it occurred to me as I was working with journalists that that could be a really helpful framework for my own story. So I began to question this idea of full recovery. And I thought, well, what if slips were more normalized and less stigmatized? And what if we could see slips as opportunities for growth rather than grounds for failure? And so once I began to reframe my thinking around recovery, I was able to really make this meaningful progress forward. And so I've lived in what I call the middle place, which is this space in between acute sickness and full recovery for many, many years. And in writing my book, I realized that this is a quite populous space, but it is so seldom talked about in the eating disorder field. And so I live my life in this place now as a mother, as a professor, as a writer, and I'm really keen on speaking truth to this place and giving it a name so that those who find themselves in this messy middle don't feel like they need to give up on recovery and also don't feel like they need to stay silent about their struggles.
Oh, so well put. And I love how you said we're all in the messy middle of something. I've heard people who
Yes.
haven't had a drink in decades refer to themselves as an alcoholic. And it's like they're acknowledging I could still slip up. And I appreciate you saying that. Whatever you're comfortable sharing, do you have a moment that you think of as like your rock bottom?
Hmm. I mean, I think for me, when I was first, before I was hospitalized, I was really just in a really bad situation when I was 13 years old. So I had tried going to the pediatrician with my father, and the pediatrician at the time, this was in the late 90s, had said that my weight loss was just a passing phase and that there was no reason to be concerned. And he said that on two separate occasions. And so in the meantime, my weight continued to fall off, and I continued to really dive deeper into these disordered behaviors around food and exercise. And my obsessive form of exercise as a child was jumping. So I would jump everywhere. I write about this in the book, and it looked quite odd. I mean, I looked like a bunny everywhere I went, but it was so compulsive. And I really had also developed obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a very common comorbidity that accompanies eating disorders. And so my whole entire body ached. My heart rate was low, my weight was low. I just was physically in a really threatening situation. And my father finally heard that Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts, where I grew up, had a very specialized eating disorder treatment program. And so they ended up admitting me right on the spot because they were afraid that I could suffer heart conditions and other ailments if I didn't get treatment. And so that was a real wake up call for me and my father. And it was the first time that we really had a name for what I was struggling with, because I was under the misguided belief that people with eating disorders didn't eat anything. And I thought, well, I'm still eating something, so I mustn't have an eating disorder. And my father didn't really know that I had one either, because eating disorders were very misunderstood then and still are today, but even more so in the late 90s. And so going to the hospital and getting admitted, that was really the lowest point, but it also signaled a turning point as well.
Wow. So what was the something? You were eating enough to fool your father. What were you eating then? And what does a typical day of meals look like for you now?
So back then, I was eating a lot of cottage cheese, a lot of kind of punitive foods, I would say, that did not taste very well, very good. And I was eating Snackwell's cookies, which were quite common at the time. They were these diet cookies that tasted like cardboard. And I was really consuming very few foods. The ones that I was consuming were really not ones that I enjoyed. I felt like I had to eat them because they were low calorie. And I didn't feel like I could eat any of the foods that I had enjoyed previously growing up. And so I was eating just enough to get by, lots of vegetables, things of that nature, but certainly wasn't enough to fuel my body at a time when I really needed to be growing and I needed far more nourishment. And so now when I think about food, I'm really careful not to label food as healthy or unhealthy. And partly that's because of just my own efforts around eating disorder prevention and just my own mindfulness around not wanting to use labels like that around my children who are 7 and 9, because I don't want them to grow up thinking that they need to ascribe moral values to food. Sometimes when we tell kids that foods are healthy or unhealthy or good or bad, they'll think that they're bad if they're eating a bad food, or good if they're eating a good food. And so for me, I really try to take a more neutral approach to the food that I eat. And I still am aware that I have tendencies to restrict my food intake. And I know that about myself. And that's part of what I always have to be mindful of, particularly if I'm in stressful situations. I know my first instinct is to really lose my appetite and not want to eat as much. And so part of my recovery has been really recognizing that and making sure that I am fueling myself properly, even though some days it takes a lot of extra work. And so I am a vegetarian, so I don't eat meat. That is one part of my diet that I suppose is somewhat restrictive, but I have never really enjoyed eating meat all that much. And so I love a lot of really good vegetarian dishes with tofu and veggies and rice. So I eat a lot of bowls like that. I find that those can get me enough nutrition and also feel relatively safe to eat. eat. And I think I also really enjoy chocolates and sweets. When I was writing my book, I'd get up super early every morning and have an iced coffee and at least one or two pieces of chocolate. And so I really try not to restrict the foods that I like. I'm always, though, trying to expand my diet as well and try new foods, because that's also part of my recovery, is not trying to pigeonhole myself or limit myself too much when it comes to eating different foods.
Do you trust yourself? Like, I know a lot of people say, just listen to your body, eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full. But for a lot of us, our body is like another person. It's almost like the bad guy, in the story. So will you allow yourself to do that? Or do you just tell yourself, Mallary, it's 8 a.m., you got to have your breakfast. Now it's noon and you got to have your tofu bowl or something like that?
Yeah, I do think it's so hard to trust our bodies. I think that is great advice in theory, but in practice, it can be really hard to actually enact. And so for me, I do have to be a lot more deliberate around what I'm eating. And I also have to recognize that often when I think that I've had enough, I probably haven't. And so I recognize that about myself. I still, to this day, see a dietitian who is trained in eating disorders, because I always want to make sure that I am maintaining some level of support. And so that I have someone who can be a sounding board and just hold me accountable in some ways to ensure that I am eating enough. And I know many people have difficulty with that in terms of figuring out when to stop or when to eat and when to listen to hunger cues. Sometimes it's my mind that interferes with my perception of how much I've actually eaten.
Sure. So you had mentioned that the eating disorder began after the passing of your mom, which I think I have no idea how I would cope with that, especially as a child. What did it do for you? Because everything we do, even if it's self-destructive, is serving some purpose. So what purpose do you think the eating disorder served? And how do you get that same, whatever little bit of good you were trying to achieve, how do you get that now with the healthier relationship with food in your body?
Yes, I think that that's so important to recognize what the illness did for us at one point in time, because that's part of just understanding the origin story and being able to then figure out, how do I still obtain that even without the disorder? And so for me, in many ways, the eating disorder, I thought, was a way to remain close to my mother. So when my mother passed away, I felt so far away from her. And the more time passed, the farther I felt from her. And so I, at the same time, was taking a health class where we were learning about good foods and bad foods, quote unquote. And I was beginning to learn that what we put into our bodies could change the size and shape of them. And so I had conjured up this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And so for me, the eating disorder was never about trying to be skinny, but more so about trying to be small and safe. And I really thought that that could help me be closer to her. And for a time, in some warped ways, it did make me feel closer to her. I remember when I was first hospitalized, it very much made me think about my mother, who was very often hospitalized when she had cancer. And my most accessible memories of my mother were some of the saddest ones of all, because they were of her in a hospital bed, not eating, particularly in her last few days, where she just had completely lost her appetite, wasn't eating. But the sicker I got, the more I sort of realized that this eating disorder was really destructive. And initially I thought maybe it would give me some control, because I couldn't control what happened to my mom's body, but I could control what I put into mine. But the irony of eating disorders is that we think that they'll give us one thing, but they end up stripping it from us completely. And so I ended up feeling more out of control than ever and farther away than ever from my mother. And so part of my recovery has really been about trying to think about the ways that I can remain close to my mother. A big part of my early stages of recovery revolved around grieving the death of my mother, and also being willing and able to ask for help, because after she died, I read the eulogy at her funeral. I went to school the day after she died. I tried to be
What?
perfect. Yes. I really thought, this is what I need to do. I need to pretend that I'm okay. And I really thought that that somehow meant that that I was strong, because in the years when my mother was sick, we always said, she's going to be better. She's so strong. She's a soldier in a battle. We just have to hold on to hope. And so I continued to maintain that mentality after she died. And it wasn't until I got sick with anorexia that I felt like, oh, I'm finally getting attention and love and care. And I had a family that loved me, but it was a different kind of attention that I was seeking in the aftermath of my mother's death. And finally, when I got sick, I got that. And so now I recognize that there are so many other things that make me special, and so many different ways that I can seek help and that I can feel closer to my mother. And so I really try to focus on filling those gaps in other ways and looking at how I can feel fulfilled without the disorder. Even though the disorder is still a part of my life in some ways, I've never fully gotten over it. I can see so much more beyond my disorder, and I no longer define myself by my disorder.
Oh my gosh, you are so strong. I know that's such a trite thing people say, especially to people facing cancer. You're a warrior, you're strong, as if the people who don't survive it weren't strong enough or didn't try hard enough. Obviously, that's insane. Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you. I feel like I learned more about you in the past 20 minutes than the whole time that we worked together. This is incredible.
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about writing the book. What were the biggest hurdles for you? What did that process look like? I know you mentioned eating chocolate, and I want to ask you about some of your other favorite foods later. But, whether people are suffering from an eating disorder or not, I think a lot of people aspire to write a book or achieve another goal. So how did you tackle that?
Yeah, so I have wanted to write a book ever since I was a little girl. And even when I was in treatment, I kept journals every day and I would write in them meticulously. And those ended up being just a gold mine for me because they helped corroborate memory. They helped me to just fact check details. And so I really used those as a form of source material when I was writing my book. And I originally conceived of this book as a literary memoir, and I thought it would primarily revolve around my story only. But as I began to think more about the book and how I wanted it to take shape, I recognized that in many ways I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, in that I am white, I identify as female, I live in a smaller body, I'm middle to upper class. And I didn't want this to be my story alone. I realized that I wanted to create more points of relatability for people. I wanted other people to see themselves reflected in this book. And I also wanted to dispel misconceptions around who does and doesn't struggle with eating disorders. And so the book follows my own journey from an 8-year-old whose mother was diagnosed to cancer up until the present day as a mother who is in recovery and who recognizes that there are genetic components of eating disorders and other things outside my control as a mom, and really kind of looks at that whole journey of my own story. But throughout the book, I also weave in a lot of the latest research around eating disorders, as well as narratives from other people with lived experience. So I ended up doing a lot of reporting for this book as a journalist. I surveyed 724 people from 44 countries around the world, and all of those individuals have lived experience with all different kinds of eating disorders. And what was fascinating to me is that of those 724 people, 85% said that they could identify with this idea of the middle place. Most had never heard of it because it's a term that I just came up with, but many people said, oh, this has suddenly given me words to describe this place I have found myself in. And you're giving me in some ways permission to talk about this space. And so many people felt like they were stigmatized because they weren't fully recovered. And so that for me was really just eye-opening. And I also interviewed about 175 folks from the survey, as well as clinicians and researchers. So It was a Herculean task in terms of just trying to weave together a personal narrative, research, science, reporting. And I hope people with lived experience certainly will read it because they're the primary audience. But I also hope that caretakers of folks with eating disorders will find it helpful, as well as medical doctors, because we know from research that doctors get about 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders. So there are so many misconceptions around eating disorders, partly because of that. So I think there's a lot of learning that needs to take place around this issue.
Amazing. I cannot wait to get my hands on this book. What is one of the biggest misconceptions? I think you're a sort of petite, like you said, white woman with blonde hair, upper middle class. So to me, maybe if we were going to pick somebody out of a lineup who had an eating disorder, people may not be shocked that it was you. But what are some of the other misconceptions?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There are so many. And I feel like I could write a book simply about the misconceptions. But one that I think is really interesting is that there are many people who struggle with anorexia, but they are not clinically underweight. And so there is a diagnosis in the Diagnostic Manual of Statistics, which is essentially the big book that diagnoses all of the different mental health disorders. But this diagnosis is called atypical anorexia. And it essentially describes people who meet all of the diagnostic criteria for anorexia, with the exception that they are not clinically underweight. And so there was a huge study that looked at adolescents with all different types of eating disorders, and it found that only 6% of them were actually clinically underweight. And that in many ways is reflective of many people's lived experience, where they are restricting their food intake, they're experiencing really serious health complications because of it, but because of genetics and other factors, they're not clinically underweight. And so when they go to the doctor and they present as someone who is in sort of a quote unquote normal size body, or even who's in a larger body, sometimes they can be stigmatized or told that they don't have an eating disorder, that they don't have any problem. Sometimes they're even prescribed weight loss. I talked with many individuals who were on the receiving end of this type of feedback. And this, again, is just part of this larger systemic issue around doctors not getting enough training on eating disorders. Even just clinicians that I've talked with outside of the eating disorder field have said, I've never heard of atypical anorexia. And there's a push in the field to even remove that title, because atypical is a bit of a misnomer in that actually more people tend to struggle with atypical anorexia than with anorexia nervosa, which is what I struggled with, which is when you are clinically underweight. So I think that this just speaks to a broader issue around the stereotypes around who does and doesn't struggle. And I think there are many people who are in larger bodies and all different size bodies, all different skin colors, all different ages, genders, ethnicities, who are struggling, but because they are not white teenage girls, are sometimes overlooked. And it becomes that much harder for them to receive the treatment that they need.
Wow. Oh, you're educating us all. Okay, we're going to start to wrap up here. I'm just going to have to read the whole book, obviously, and you listening are as well. But talk to the person who is a caregiver. You mentioned caregivers. Talk to your dad 20 years ago when he was maybe picking up on some of these signs and didn't know how to help you, because I'm guessing that the person with the problem isn't going to raise their hand and say, yeah, I need treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so I think that it's really important to recognize warning signs. And some of those warning signs can include isolation. A lot of people who struggle with eating disorders or who are slipping into more dangerous territory around disordered eating will tend to isolate themselves. They will skip meals. They may just say that they're not hungry, or they may kind of zip out of the house early before breakfast is served and say, well, I'm just going to school, or I'm doing this or that. And so those are all different warning signs that we need to be aware of. And I think what's really important is not ignoring those warning signs, but really trying to have honest conversations with your loved one around what you're seeing. You don't necessarily want to diagnose something because you need a little bit more information before you start figuring out what really is going on. But talking with someone and saying, I'm recognizing that there's some changes in your behavior behaviors, or I notice that you don't seem to enjoy a lot of the foods that you once used to eat, or I notice that you're consuming, different types of foods and don't seem as happy, or you're going to the bathroom all the time after eating, whatever it might be, just sort of being able to have conversations around that, I think is so important, because there may very well be denial on the individual's part. But I think if they know that there are people watching and people who care for them, that can open up a pathway for them to ask for help, and to not feel ashamed of that. Because I think that although I talk about the middle place as being this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery, I think that there is also this middle place between a trigger and then one's descent into a disorder. And if we can catch people in that middle place, I think that we can help a lot more people earlier on. And we know that the earlier someone receives help, the better the prognosis. But it's a challenge. I don't envy caretakers. I know how hard it can be.
Okay, you started the conversation by saying that the disordered eating was a way for you to stay close to your mom. So what's a way you found to do that today? I'm sure there are many, but what's one?
Yeah, so I write a lot about my mom, and that really is a way that I stay connected with her, and it feels like I can keep her memory alive through writing. And so I actually just finished writing an essay about what it was like to turn 40 a couple months ago, because my mom was 40 when she died of cancer. And so now I have officially outlived my mother, and I wrote about what it means to outlive your mother and what it means to begin this next phase of life that your mother never got to experience. And to be putting this book out into the world at the same age that my mother was when she died feels like this really beautiful way of just holding space for her memory, but also beginning this next phase of my life. And so I write about my mom a lot in the book. And I think just writing about her and publishing those pieces is a way to feel connected, and also to help other people think about just their own relationships with their mothers and what that means to them.
Oh, this is beautiful. I could talk to you all day. Okay, we got to start to land this plane. What's a food that you remember your mom loving?
Oh, well, the first one that came to mind is Jiffy Pop popcorn. So she used to love just shaking the Jiffy Pop over the oven, and then we would watch it just grow, and we would love eating that together. We often would eat that and watch Seinfeld. My parents let me watch Seinfeld when I was a young child, and that was just one of my favorite pastimes. So Jiffy Pop, and then mocha almond chip ice cream. That was one of her favorites, and also was one of mine.
Oh, I love that. Do you eat popcorn with your kids?
I do, yes. And I recently turned them on to Jiffy Pop. And so they have been enjoying that. And yes, I definitely like eating it alongside them.
Full circle moment. Okay, last question. We are really focusing on joy this year. I mean, there's so much bad news in the world, and this season we just want to really lift everybody up, thinking about the things that we have a zest for. And you've already mentioned a few, your memories of popcorn with your mom and eating chocolate as you were going through the writing process. What's a food that you just can really get excited about eating that you probably wouldn't have allowed yourself to at the height of your illness?
Well, there's one comfort food that I love, and it is creamy korma. So just an Indian dish that is cashew based. It has a really thick, creamy sauce, and I usually have it with paneer and vegetables. And I love it because it feels indulgent to me. And it's a food that I never would have allowed myself to eat when I was sick. And I don't think it's a food that I would have ever envisioned eating. And so I often will eat it with my husband. We sometimes have pseudo date nights where we put the kids to bed and then go upstairs, and my husband will get takeout, and then we'll eat the takeout and watch a show or a movie. But that is one of my favorite dishes, alongside a samosa with chutney. So that's my go-to comfort dish.
I want to be the third wheel on these date nights. I'm also a vegetarian. Love Indian food. Mallary, it was so great to talk to you. The book is incredible. You're incredible. Is there anything else we didn't touch on that you want to mention?
Just that I lived in Florida for 10 years, and I write about my time in Florida a lot in the book because that was a really pivotal time for me. It's where I met my husband. It's where I had my first child. And so I think fondly about my time in Florida and just how pivotal that period was for me. And so I am going to also be in St. Pete for my book tour. So I'm excited to be back in familiar territory soon.
Love it. We're excited to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time. This was really special, and you're just amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Mallary Tenore Tarpley is a journalism professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Her book is titled Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. You can catch her on Tuesday, August 19th at Tombolo Books in St. Petersburg in conversation with the city's poet laureate, Gloria Muñoz, and you'll find a link with all the details in the show notes or on our website, thezestpodcast.com. I'm Dalia Colon. I produce The Zest with Andrew Lucas and Alexandria Ebron. The Zest is a production of WUSF, copyright 2025, part of the NPR network.